So thank you very much for the organization. I think they put together a fantastic set of panels, and this one indeed on identity construction through difference. And without further ado, I would invite Guilherme Wisnik, who will be the first speaker. And I will just give a very short introduction because Guilherme's CV is immense. But let me just synthesize it by saying that Guilherme is an educator, an architectural critic, a prolific author and curator, among many other things. He received his PhD from FAUSP, where we are today. And he taught in many schools in Brazil, but also in France. Currently, he teaches at FAUSP, and he is the co-leader of the research group Architecture, Art, and Contemporary City, Works and Projects, Dialogues and Frictions. His paper today is titled Being Public in Private Spaces and Vice Versa, Brazilian Art and Architecture in the Late 1960s. At around, Guilherme, so please share your screen. At around 15 minutes, you will hear a sound from my phone, which will be annoying, but it's just a little sign to ask you to wrap up.
Thank you, Nelson. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for introducing me, and thank you all, the organization of the conference. Let's start, we have a short time. So in this short presentation, I will try to bring together radical productions in visual arts and architecture in Brazil in the transition from the 1960s to the 70s, the moment of the worst hardening of the dictatorial repression in the country. So at the end of the 1960s, Brazilian architecture certainly arrives at one of its moments of greatest radicality. Almost a decade after the inauguration of Brasília, the center of gravity of national architectural production had already moved from Rio de Janeiro to São Paulo, the country's industrial and financial heart. Born inside the School of Engineering, the teaching of architecture in São Paulo has a strong technical stress. At the same time, its buildings had to find ways of incorporating the opacity of a city that grew very fast and chaotically under the predatory impulse of real estate speculation. Thus, unlike what happened in Rio, Paulista architecture did not develop an open and transparent relation between inside and outside, based on the formal lightness and hedonist integration with tropical nature. If Carioca modern architecture appeared in the 1930s based on the example of the first purist Le Corbusier, São Paulo architecture of the 60s was strongly influenced by the last brutalist Le Corbusier. Vila Nova Artigas, the leader of this group, the so-called Paulista School, combined the critical aspect of the revision of the machine utopia with a clear Marxian perspective, for whom the traces left by the wooden molds on the concrete surfaces were perceived as signs of labor in the final work. An active member of the Brazilian Communist Party, Artigas used huge masses of concrete as metaphors for the conflicts present in society. Already in the 1950s, the Italian architect Lina Bobardi, then recently arrived in Brazil, had premonitorily observed that Artigas' houses did not obey the laws followed by the routine life of man, but on the contrary, imposed a law on him, a moral that is always severe. And almost 20 years later, between 1968 and 69, Artigas would effectively come to prove her entirely right, designing and building those that are the two most radical houses of his career, in my opinion, the Telmporto and Marcirani residences. Both are boxes of exposed concrete, almost completely blind and facing their own interiors. In the case of the Telmporto house in particular, the rooms even lack windows, and the concrete used for walls, floors, and furniture gives it a rough aspect. This process culminates in Paulo Mendes da Rocha's design for Fernando Milan residence, in which the architect chose to make the living room's floor in asphalt as an extension of the garage floor into the house. Here again, the rooms do not open to the outside through windows. Their internal balconies open instead to an unusual interior view, the kitchen. And just as in the house the architect built for himself some years earlier in Butantã neighborhood, the room's walls do not touch the ceiling, make the internal space of the residence, from the standpoint of noises and smells, a unique and integrated environment. It is, in Flávio Motta's words, a space created as a social project, quoting, whose starkness supposes a mode of living similar to something like a rationalized favela, where each one accepts sharing space with all the others without solid barriers, but in new conditions of human respect to be sought for. He concludes, it is a proposal that demands a response because it is a work of creation that implies its social responsibility. As these examples make clear, what architects such as Artigas and Mendes da Rocha were looking for at that point was the urbanization of domestic life. This is my point. That is a maximal abolition of intimacy, eliminating personal idiosyncrasies tied to the romantic bourgeois idea of home. What they wished, thus, was to abolish private space and its secrets in favor of a civic idea of totally public life. The houses and schools as forms of the city's collective life, where one's freedom is shaped by the others, given that the rules of social order controls the will of individual subjectivity. These houses are thus entirely exteriorized, even spatially introverted. Speaking about his project for the Faculty of Architecture and Urban Planning building, Artigas observes, whoever gives a shout inside the building will feel the responsibility of having interfered in the whole environment. Then the individual gets educated, feels urbanized, gains team spirit. At the same moment of extreme political repression in the country, in which an important part of cultural production took the form of a kind of aesthetic guerrilla, visual artists also produced works of great radicality. Elliot Sica's Whitechapel show, which took place in 1969 in London, is a case in point. Sica was already deep into his quest to break with contemplation-oriented objectual art, transforming the spectator in a participant and bringing the body into the work's experience in increasingly active ways. He called this environmental anti-art. The point was to blur the border between art and life, unfolding an avant-garde project that goes back to constructivist painters such as Mondrian and Malevich. A project that led the Brazilian artists to duplicate life in ever more powerful interiors, which was nevertheless ever more preserved from the world's contagion, as visual artist Nuno Ramos sharply observes. This little paradox, which Ramos sees in Sica's work, sets the tone for much of Brazilian contemporary art. The act of materializing the work in the world ends by creating a refuge within the same world. more than a big retrospective of his career, the Whitechapel experience is where the Eden Project was first realized. It was an environmental structure that transformed the gallery space into a place participation, promoting, in the artist's words, the creation of freedom in the interior space. These installations should be used and even inhabited by the show's visitors participants, domesticizing public space, the art gallery. Bed bolides and penetrables with foam floors, sack blankets, and nylon nets created a space where it was possible to lie down after having walked on fields of sand, hay, and water. Such environments served as experimental modules for the construction of house spaces, as Oiticica called them, prefiguring the idea of a new world leisure. In short, Hélio tried to create in Whitechapel experience a warm space where the joy of being absorbed in its childish warmth could instill a new behavior in the people arriving from the cold streets of London in the wintertime. The warmth's coziness as an antithesis of the city's cold and impersonal space. Back to my initial subject, it's interesting to note that in the Brazilian case, my point also, if the brutalist houses by Artigas and Mendes da Rocha sought to urbanize domestic life, Oiticica's penetrables inversely intended to domesticize public life. Additionally, if categories such as collectivity and industrial materials were guiding principles for the architect's projects, the artist's proposal was oriented towards intimacy, leisure, and receptiveness, guided by a light, hedonistic craftsmanship. A significant contrast, therefore. This doesn't mean, however, that architects and artists should be placed in opposed poles. These crucial differences aside, what both sides were doing at that point was problematizing the boundaries between public and private spheres so as to transcend them, inventing new and demanding ways of living. As a matter of fact, Flávio Motta's acute depiction of these Paulista houses as rationalized favelas pinpoints their quality of spatial indeterminacy. For they refuse an environmental limits and conventions and open instead onto the intersubjective conditioning of their users qua action and reaction. It is no coincidence that the large internal spaces of the Faculty of Architecture building, with its active play of loose and uneven plans, can be easily associated to Oiticica's nuclei. Environments formed by the explosion of the two-dimensional supports and by the autonomy of chromatic tonal planes suspended in the air in a continuous and non-hierarchical way. The case is that if the architects saw themselves as drivers of more responsible civil behavior in a country with no tradition in public sphere, Oiticica in turn affirmed subjectivity as an antidote to the instrumentalization of social relations through provocative experiments in public unproductivity. In summary, for the conclusion, thinking of the brutalist houses and schools by Artigas and Mendes da Rocha, it is necessary to highlight that despite the urban discourse that accompanies them, they show a clearly defensive stance towards the city. That is, they do not act in the conflicted arena of urban spaces so as to transform it. On the contrary, They seem to derive from a renunciation from the attitude of insisting in the transformation of that chaotic and decayed urban spaces, compensated, on the other hand, by a new utopian wager in the creation of protected laboratories for a more generous sociability in the inside of buildings where the windows open to the sky. Likewise, the rigorous external rigidity of these buildings is what dialectically enables the creation of an extreme internal spatial indeterminacy, allowing for previously unforeseen uses. So much so that if we just replace those heavy concrete curtain walls with diaphanous tulle curtains once, as used by Oiticica, we might catch a sudden glimpse of the Faculty of Architecture building as if it were an enormous penetrable. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Guilherme. We did it even, below the 15 minutes mark. So very well done, and actually very nicely articulated. The presentation was beautiful. Thank you so much. And I would like to ask the audience to, for instance, those who want already to put some question to Guilherme, just to put the question in the chat. And as we move on, then I will read these questions, and then at the end we start the debate already, because otherwise maybe you lose the momentum of the intriguing let's say provocations that Guilherme brought with this paper. So let's move on to the second presentation. So this is a presentation with a trio. A Luso-Brazilian trio, I would say. Luana Cavalcanti, who's currently in the University of Porto in Portugal, Raquel Paulino from the University of Porto, and Ricardo Paiva from the Federal University of Ceará in Brazil. And their paper has the title, Discontinuities in the Treatment of the Public-Private Interface in Social Housing Produced in Brazil and Portugal. So again, we have public and private as the two sort of dialectic concepts at stake. So please share your screen.
Thank you. So good afternoon to all the participants in this panel. My name is Luana. I am a PhD student at Faculty of Architecture in the University of Porto in Portugal, and professor at the University Center of FAMetro in Fortaleza, Ceará. I will present part of my ongoing PhD research entitled Discontinuities in the Public-Private Interface, the case of the projects of Caraíba by Joaquim Guedes in Brazil and Malagueira by Álvaro Siza in Portugal. This work and presentation include the contributions of professors Raquel Paulino and Ricardo Paiva. I must start enlightening that my approach and the research that support this presentation is based on the analysis of the morphological aspects that has been explored in different projects of housing neighborhoods. Therefore, we have been looking for a paradigmatic examples in the proposition of a new public-private relationship, both in Brazilian and Portuguese architectures. Based on this, we focused the research on the housing projects developed in the mid-70s, a period in which both countries were in conflicting socio-political situations that created the opportunity to develop new approaches to the housing problem, and new type of morphological solutions that, between programmatic and contextual differences, reflect important similarities. As Cesar puts it, quote, everything ends and begins at the ground level. And it is in this encounter with the ground, and therefore with the human public space, that our object of study takes shape, and the scope of the research is defined, the public-private interface. The interface is taken as an environment built in between the public and private domains, and between different access conditions, opened and enclosed. This space can be composed or influenced by elements related to the street and sidewalk conditions, by the frontal setback of buildings in urban plots, by characteristics of its facades and its category of use.
Luana, just, I don't know if, okay, yeah, because we were only seeing the title page. I thought that was some problem. Maybe you could go full screen. It will give us.
Just a minute.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, it was good.
Yeah. Okay. So, Malagueira, considered to be a direct architectural testimony of South-North experimentation undertaken, arises from the debate upon the interdependence between the collective space and the design of housing units in a dense urban context, with the islands of Porto serving as a typological reference. In this way, CISA assimilates the attention given to the local circumstance, both as methodological basis and as a design principle, also establishing ideas that dialogue with natural and building pre-existence. Caraíba, on the other hand, was born out of the need to support mining activities in the Brazilian countryside. So, in the established parallel between Caraíba and Malagueira, it is important to emphasize that there are intrinsic differences. The condition of a new city and that of a quarter. Caraíba was created to be, as far as possible, a self-sufficient nucleus, given its isolation in the hinterlands of Bahia. Malagueira was established next to within the city of Évora, including yet another pre-existing series of settlements in its immediate surroundings. The study of these works, their similarities and dissidence, focus on the analysis of the public-private interfaces, allowed us to find the following continuity. The attention given to the local context as a project principle. In both projects, there was a true study of the urban and architectural patterns of the pre-existing settlements, in addition to deep knowledge of the local cultural habits. This analysis led to incorporation of the local way of living, mainly concerning to the structure of direct interface between housing and the streets, with the predefinition of mediation device between exterior and interior and public and private space. Now, I'm going to talk about one of the discontinuities or contrasts, the definition and characterization of the patios in the organization of the housing units. In Malagueira, there was an initial preposition for two types of housing units that differed from one another by the location of the patio, at the front in the region of the interface, or at the back of the plot inside the region or outside the region of the interface. The plots were designed within the fixed dimensions, and the typology were developed exploring an evolutive principle, allowing future transformations. In Caraíba, the dwelling's internal organization follows the local construction logic. The living room closest to the street, the bedrooms leaning against the side walls, and the kitchen located at the back of the house. Innovation lies in incorporating the patio to the domestic space organization. Gads do not locate it in their interface, however, but in the central region of the units. The patio in Caraíba's dwellings is then a mechanism to improve environmental comfort inside the units. It is clear then that in CISA project, there is a fundamental concern with the relationship between the house and the house unit and the street, the public-private interface. The public-private interface, with or without the patio, is the principle that determines the morphology of the units in the urban complex. Back to Caraíba, the distinction of interfaces from lot to lot does not happen in a self-evident manner, since there is a grouping of typologies distributed in the urban complex. Another discontinuity, the presence of the sidewalk as an integral part of public-private interface in Caraíba, and the shared roads of Malagueira quarter, not mediated by sidewalks. Both proposers are extruded from the concepts of high density in short heights, leading to a greater communication between the housings and the street. The narrow width of the streets in Malagueira allows for the proximity between opposite interfaces, making a real door-to-door dialogue. In Caraíba, Guedes uses them as a large public space prone to afforestation to alleviate the climate. In Malagueira, street and sidewalk spaces are often merged into one, referencing the historical features of the streets in Évora. Another discontinuity, post-occupation chains that demonstrate different appropriations in the project's interfaces. The modifications in Malagueira, in addition to the possibilities of expansion and typological diversification, are located mainly on the surface of the facades in the form of paintings, while in the interfaces in Caraíba were almost completely changed in their forms, with the occupation of the public areas in favor of more private space. One of the continuities, the search for diversity in the development of the interface design. In Caraíba, this point is marked mainly by the misalignment of the front of the plots with the public space of the sidewalk. I'm talking about this misalignment here. While in Malagueira, the residential interfaces are diversified by the various topological choice, suitable for extensions and with different heights of the walls and different locations of the patios. Furthermore, in Malagueira Quarter, the relationship or the passage between public and private is made gradually in urban plan, exploring a principle of approximation. The park, the squares, the service hub make the first contact with the public and the collective in the new neighborhoods. The pipeline marks a moment of transition, making a kind of filter that marks the entrance of each street leading to each house. It is in the commercial center of Caraíba that the public-private interface is articulated in a kind of pilotis gallery that enlarges and shadows the pedestrian space of the sidewalk. The nature of the limit becomes milder, even hybrid, neither open nor closed, a public space for collective use shaded by private spaces. This gallery also makes way into the interior of the blocks, breaking the linearity of pedestrian path while creating sites and routes that show other forms of occupation in the city. The pipeline in Malagueira and the pilotis under the central buildings in Caraíba marks the possibilities in which the interface acquires not only a new form and materiality, but also a strong symbolism and identity that articulates, gives unit, and builds the urban landscape. CISA works finds in the local context the establishment of a spatial dynamic that is consolidated in the attention given to the housing interface and from the pipeline, a poster that ends up becoming an alternative for the formation of a new urban space and relation that also references the city with which it's connected. In Caraíba, Guedes exercised an experimentalism common to his practice in the articulation of private and public space with the strong respect for the rigid climate of the heartland, highlighting the way buildings in the city center approach and related to the ground and the public space. In both projects, the affinity with their location occurs not only as a formal or material strategy, but as a project methodology that underlines new ways of living, rooted in tradition, with different branches in the critical and typical contemporaneity of their time. Therefore, these works reveal possibilities for dealing with the transition between private environment and public domain, using the knowledge accumulated in the disciplinary field of architecture and crossing it with the knowledge of the culture and the history of its regions, exposing broader cultural values. To conclude, I would like to highlight that the innovation occurred both in Caraíba and Malagueira projects, which at first glance can be characterized as many typological, are understood here as a proposition for a new look at the public-private interface, going beyond the constructed housing environment and consecrating itself as articulating element of building in urban space. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Luana. Well, also within the time slot, so we are good. It's going to be a very nice, we will have lots of time for discussion. I hope we can keep this momentum there. So let's move then to the next presentation. And so this time, we have Daniela Moro. And I'm sorry, Luana, because I had your CV also to read, but then I read the thirds. It's good that you introduce yourself. Sorry for that. But then I'm going to introduce Daniela. Daniela earned her title of Architect and Urbanist from the Federal University of Paraná in Curitiba, Brazil, with an undergraduate thesis, Blurring the Map, a strategy to uncover concealed spatial narratives. And since then, Daniela develops research on processes of mapping and representation of the urban space. She is currently pursuing a master's degree in architectural theory, history, and critique from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, where she develops research exploring visual narratives and architectural notations. And the title of Daniela's paper today is Blurring the Map, depicting the city of Curitiba as both spectacle and experience.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation to present my paper. It's an honor to be here. This work I'm about to present is entitled Blurring the Map, and it's based on a research started in 2017, which I continued to develop until last year. There are two main scopes on this work. The first is the operative process of constructing maps. Here taking the map as a graphic framework for exploration and also a dialectical tool relative to the main problem that I chose to address. And the second is the problem itself, the relation between the experienced space, the inhabited space, and the image of the space, its representations. Mainly, it's spectacular representations, which in this case are made evident in a specific urban setting. So it is mostly an exploratory work, but is also a critical work since I am mapping a city, in this case, Curitiba in Brazil, that invests so much in the imagistic appeal to the point that sometimes the urban space itself gets overshadowed by its broadcasted image. So to start, I will briefly present some of the key questions of this paper, used to support the argument of this contradictory duality. So we can consider the map as one of the potential interfaces between space and its representations. And we know that the map itself, it is a contradictory tool, given that it is a transcription of the reality, but at the same time, maps can also precede the reality as a subjective representation that selects, omits, adds, or even distorts information. And sometimes both the transcription and the manipulation entails a difficulty to recognize what is the represented image and what is the space behind this image. So on the subject of image versus habitability, one of the arguments that I started from was the quote by Guy Debord, in which he states that this distance between the spectacle and the inhabitant as actor, quote, is expressed by the fact that the individual gestures are no longer his own. They are the gestures of someone else who represents them to him. The spectator does not feel at home anywhere because the spectacle is everywhere. So basically, I took these two concepts as an opposition, the image, or the city in the form of spectacle, directed by its imagistic features, and the other side, the experience, the dwelling, which is the use of space by people. And initially, to illustrate this duality in some way, I selected two archetypal maps to compare them in their final products. One is related to the city of Curitiba, attempting to depict its imagistic appeal. And the other is a situation it's mapped by Debord, created by his own experience of the city of Paris. So let's start by the spectacle. The 1990s decade in the city of Curitiba were marked by a strong market appeal into the idea of a model city. And the city largely invested in graphic products that intend to represent what experience the city was supposed to mean, but according to those who designed it, including its landmarks, parks, public transportation, amid this idea of an ideal urbanism. Well, we're taking the fact that the map can also precede the territory. We can consider that in Curitiba, these graphic products helped to create a distorted image of the city, mainly an idea of the city. So this idea of the city has to do with the condition of image prevalence, such as Debord's concept of spectacle. In a city that relies much in its broadcasted image, its spaces progressively result from this logic of spectacle. On the other side, we have a map produced by Debord in the context of Paris in the late 1960s decade. If in the first map it is presented a guide to inhabit the city, Debord's maps, as an ironic reading of the touristic appeals of Paris, presents itself almost like a guide to get lost in the city as a way to further inhabit it. However, taking the critique by Otávio Leonídio related to Debord's maps, the apparent disorder in the representation of Debord's maps does not fully correspond to the thesis his collage proposes to portray, of a space shaped by the drift. So according to Leonídio, Debord's maps did not fully break with traditional cartography. The fragments and arrows actually follow compositional roles of a balanced and hierarchical disposition. So the side-by-side arrangement of these two archetypal maps and its final representations, even in their contradiction of meaning, intends to explicit some operative similarities, taking the concepts of mapping procedures. So in this way, we can identify three main operative tools based on James Corner mapping operations that can be listed as the field, the fragments, and the connections. Well, in a basic reading, both maps use a zenithal perspective as a field, depicting a central area of an urban center. Both use highly defined fragments, like a collage, and both use distorted vectors of connections, since these vectors do not correspond to real distances, or even a distance. So as the object of this paper, I intend to rehearse a single mapping process based on plotting two opposing depictions in the same sign. And as an initial methodology, it was used this common graphic mechanisms of those two archetypal maps. So in Curitiba, the territory of Rua 15 de Novembro was chosen because of its contradictions. On the one hand, we have a dense presence of imagistic elements, and along with that, the attempt to bring up the spectacle dimension of the city. On the other hand, there is a strong urban vitality in the region. So it's actually a site where human appropriation of space is evident. So we have this contradiction between a site with a potential for appropriation, but also very regulated to preserve the broadcasted image of the region. While this attempt is try to hide this contradiction, mapping process can actually bring them to light. So to begin the mapping process, to define a field, I started with the process of gathering as most information as possible in the form of traditional figure ground maps. These maps were printed in transparent paper in order to enable a further recombination of or mixing of layers. And as an inventory, images, fragments, objects, and events and appropriations were cataloged in the same binary representation. This approach resulted in a database of layers that allowed for the mapping process to continue. But it also made clear the impossibility of trying to exhaust the endless reality. For the selection of the fragments within so many layers, I searched in those layers some components where the duality of the site was present, such as historical facades with their image preserved on the outside but abandoned on the side, or the element of the pedestrian street, in theory totally open for appropriation, but only for predetermined uses. To produce more critical representations of the site, one of the reference was the notational process of Bernard Tschumi. So in this triptych organization, we can explore a notation that could incorporate a kind of space for dialectics, a more open and less hierarchical disposition of fragments. At the end of this process, there were 5 elements, here represented in the columns, that could compose and make recognizable the map of Joaquin's. Some elements are public, like the pedestrian street, and others highly private, like the elevators. Some of them, like the galleries, are both public and private. So in this notation, the lines correspond to 3 different ways of representing the same element. The first line with the photographic icons representing the imagery variable. The second line intends to represent the flow variable, and it was included to place abstract notations into geographic scale. And the last line to the time variable, intended to compare graphically the degree of drift present in each element. So moving on about the connections, instead of the static and definitive connections present in the archetypal maps, I tried to find a recombination method that could enable multiple spatial performances with the map as a starting point. Each frame of the matrix could be replaced if it was mapped in a different day or in a different hour. So this use of dynamic vectors of connection is intended to bring the movement and time not only as variables, but also to the mapping process in the context of the map as a framework. So we can reorganize these frames in countless ways, similar to the act of montage. So this process actually takes advantage of the conflict in a depiction that ends up subverting predefined images. Beyond subversion of program or a public-private inversion. Returning to the mapping operations, James Corner points out the plotting act as a synthesis exercise to complete a mapping process. In face of the infinite number of relationships and approximations or subversions between experience and spectacle that could arise from the matrix, the act of plotting was necessary to evidence at least one synthesis of this graphic dialectic. So in the same way as in the beginning, when we oppose the board's maps with a tourist map, here we have a real event in Curitiba, photographic in a way that shows its spectacular character on the right, but we could also plot it in a different way, selecting and omitting elements from this territory according to the matrix. The choice for this particular event was because it is an image highly broadcasted by the city. So as a critical and also ironic act, the mapping of this event intends to show precisely the conflicts that arise from this imagistic appropriation, and mainly due to this inversion of public and private space. In this event, for example, the pedestrian street is taken by people forming a human wall, and we can see this element as just open for those who want to watch the spectacle. So it becomes almost a theater building. At the same time, a lot of people could take the private elevators to watch the spectacle from the office windows, almost subverting this element. So instead of what would be expected in the photograph, what stands out is how the use of spaces and objects that compose this territory were actually subverted by people, how the programs and uses are radically transformed due to a spectacular event. So this representation goes in the opposite direction of the photography. It actually intends to show a higher level of appropriation of structures and elements that would usually not be expected. And by using a real event to make this argument, the spatial duality becomes more evident, since if it were not for the existence of this event, this could be a simple hypothetical recommendation of elements of the matrix. It is evident that other events less directed to the image were also analyzed during this mapping process, but this case was chosen to be exposed as one of the most contradictory and radical subversions, depicting also how paradoxical are these urban spaces in contemporary society. So to conclude, more than focusing on analyzing this specific event, the idea is more to show that depth of mapping as a process of blurring and rearranging fragments and elements of space by a critical actor, the one producing the map, can be a complex process that leads to multiple and often unexpected results. When we think about the idea of notation as an operative tool, we could also say that the blurring the map also relates to mixing its role as representation in one hand and intent on the other hand. So the idea that it simultaneously proceeds and derives from the territory. Beyond that, the act of blurring intends to remove the focus from the sharpened and extremely realistic representations, opening space for other interpretations and then for other possibilities of acting in the urban space. In this case of Curitiba, by analyzing the dual character of a specific space, we can actually attempt to break up with the Magic representations in order to trace new images of active experience within the spectacle. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniela. Beautiful drawings, and that exhibition is still you still have that let's say assemblage of drawings that you produced.
Yes.
Have you showed it somewhere, or you keep it only for yourself?
Just for me.
Oh, that's a pity. Okay, thank you so much. Then again, for all of those in the audience, please, if you want, can write your questions for the speakers. And if you want to put it in public, it's fine. If you want to put it only privately to me, it's also fine. And then I will select and ask them these questions. And now we move on to the fourth and last presentation. This time is the duo. Oops. Oh, that was the sign of the 15 minutes. This duo with two Brazilian speakers. I don't know if are the two present here, Alice Queiroz and Eric Crevels.
Hello, I will be presenting.
Okay, great, Alice. And so let me introduce Alice then. Alice is a visual artist and an architect and an urban planner. She's also an independent curator and a photographer, so lots of things. She develops her research in the investigation of the urban landscape and daily relations with the city, reflecting on the socioeconomic hierarchies that determine the urban context. She worked in project management as a financial, production, and prospecting manager for open calls and partnerships since 2017. So a very eclectic CV. Yes. And the other co-author of this paper, Eric, is also an architect, urban planner, and craftsman, which is a nice line for a CV. I don't see that very often. And he received his Master of Architecture from the Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais. And currently, I think he must be close by because he's a PhD at TU Delft and looking for ways that may bridge the boundaries between theory and practice, looking to reshape the urban experience and architectural practice in inventive and socially responsible ways. The paper that Alice will present is titled Urban Predation, the Symbolic Economy of the Pichu. I will give you the sign at 15 minutes if need be. So go for it, Alice.
Okay, so hello, greetings to everyone here today. Repeating just a little bit what Nelson said, My name is Alice Queiroz. I'm a Brazilian architect and visual artist, and will present the paper Urban Predation, the Symbolic Economy of the Picho, written together with my colleague and also architect, Eric Creves. We both graduated in the city of Belo Horizonte, from where we brought a practical example to introduce our work today. Belo Horizonte is a state capital and has a metropolitan region with just over 6 million people. Since 2017, the city has been gifted with the realization of CURA, an acronym in Portuguese for Urban Art Circuit, a festival with paintings of building facades and other interventions. Last year, CURA reached its 5th edition, and today it's a Brazilian festival with the largest collection of mural art. Although already consolidated and acclimated, the festival that has become a reference in and outside the country has faced at least 2 major lawsuits against its works in the city. The first case happened against Ancestral Hybrid by the artist Crioula, a work created to address her experiences as a Black Brazilian woman and to honor Black and Native peoples. The realization of the artistic painting was approved at the condominium's assembly and by the building's administration, including the renovation and necessary improvements on the facade. Nonetheless, last year, a single resident of the building, a white man, triggered a law from the military dictatorship period to require the erasure of the work, claiming that, I quote, "it is a decoration of dubious taste." Statements of this kind have been interpreted as an expression of structural racism to disqualify Black people, Black aesthetics, and Black culture. Given the relevance to fight against racism, especially in the current Brazilian political context, we believe it is essential to strengthen narratives against the growing neo-fascism. It is unacceptable, therefore, such an attack on an Afrocentric work from an African diaspora descendant. Just a few months later, the festival suffered another attack, this time from the civil police. The organizers and 5 artists who participated in the execution of the work God is Mother by Robin Santana face the possibility of being criminally charged and imprisoned for up to 4 years. The central issue seems to be the content again. The image of a Black mother with her children, framed by the aesthetics of the Picho, was qualified as an environmental crime, a standard justification to criminalize various types of urban intervention. It is curious, to say the least, that urban art is treated this way in the same state where 2 of the biggest environmental crimes in Brazilian history took place. The rupture of 2 mining dams of the company Vale killed hundreds and affected thousands of people, contaminating large areas with highly toxic waste, and no justice was made yet. As we can see, Picho is in a fragile situation even when it's part of the formal art system. And although it is aesthetically disqualified, there are many reasons behind its disapproval due to our urban and social complexities. Given this reality, what kind of other perspective could then help us understand these situations? Following this aspiration to seek new approaches, we decided to rely on anthropological studies, searching for non-dominant epistemologies that would allow us to think about the phenomenon of Picho and try to analyze it with a fresh and non-colonial perspective. In this paper, we tried to consider the relationships between those who practice Picho and the city through an analogy with the predator and prey metaphysics, present in Amerindian cosmologies and described by Eduardo Viveiros de Castro. Before delving into that, however, let's first understand what is Picho. Pichos are interventions on elements of the city with various themes, also designated as graffiti. It has been a performance since antiquity, with rock painting, becoming an important representation of its contemporary way of life. These graphics gained momentum in the 1970s in New York and are now found in the cities mixed with other random interventions, such as election propaganda, advertising, or even love messages. Graffiti and picho are a powerful way of producing identity and communication, conquering large urban centers worldwide and using the city as a support for expression. They represent not only plastic practices and communicative tools, but also culture and urban experience. Despite that, picho and graffiti artists face severe criminalization oriented by unjust, racist, and classist values. It is relevant, therefore, to defend these very diverse agents who use and build the city in a libertarian way, turning picho into a subversive art against an excluding city. We based our work on studies of the Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro. He describes that many Amerindian societies possess a perspectivist ontology, meaning that their way of understanding reality considers that the physical constitution of the world is bound to the point of view of the observer, and that the appearances of beings depend on the nature of their interactions. The predator-prey duality, or the predation regime, is the most frequent model with which these interactions between different subjectivities are perceived and interpreted. An example of that is we see the jaguar as a jaguar because it hunts us, but the jaguar sees itself as a human and sees us as wild pigs or other form of prey. More importantly, in perspectivist ontology, not only the relationships between species are understood in this framework, but social interactions within human society are also often described and explained in the terms of the predation economy. For example, according to Oyara Bonilla, another Brazilian anthropologist, the Palmari people make sense of their contact with the Western merchants by the same scheme, incorporating the idea of the boss in their own cosmological structure of commercial predation. Our reasoning is that if relationships between beings and even between indigenous and Western societies are frequently perceived by these indigenous peoples through the logic of the predation, why not use this logical system to look at our own interior relations from a different perspective? Using the symbolic economy of predation allows us to imagine an intersubjective relationship between the picho artists and the city, in which the complex socioeconomic processes of the urban environment appear to the picho artist as a form of agency. An agency that, in this particular case, can be interpreted as predatory. The picho artist, as we have seen, is generally a victim or a prey of unequal social conditions materialized in territorial and economic alienation. This denial of access to the city becomes, in fact, a denial to the right to the city. On the other hand, the picho emerges as an act of resistance. It is a symbolic reclamation of urban territory, a form of introducing the aesthetics of social struggle against the background of institutionalized and privately owned urban morphology. The artists prey on the city's territory by marking places with their signatures and graphical pieces, reclaiming the physical and political territories from which they are excluded and challenging the predatory agency of the urban institutions. This phenomenon can be interpreted as a symbolic shape-shifting of those who practice picho into a new body, the legitimized and empowered body of the artist. So, we see how the predatory mechanics of the picho also extends over other territories, reconquesting spatial, artistic, and political territories and merging together the different facets of urban life. This grants the artist a new subjectivity that implies a first-person pronoun, agency, and protagonism in the actions and relationships inside these territories, or in perspectivist terms, a predatory position. As we stated in the paper, this interpretation should not be considered a scientific description of how Amerindians would perceive the picho phenomenon. What we present here is rather the process of what could be named an experience of analysis, using the descriptions of Amerindian cosmology as a set of lenses. We intend not to discover anything about these peoples, but about Western urban life. Our objective is to search epistemological possibilities, new rationalities that may help us look at the city with new eyes and gaze at it from a decolonial stance. We hope that this exercise can expand our ways of thinking and understanding the urban environment in its complexity. Ways to help us tackle difficult issues, such as the agency of institution and the contradictory position of picho artists. Knowing that the picho cannot be properly understood without taking urban problems into account, our main goal remains poetical, in its meaning of creating new possibilities, imagining new futures, and crafting new horizons. Thank you very much for your attention. We are very proud and grateful to be in this event.
Thank you so much, Alice. Also, within the time slot. So, all great, 4 great presentations. Thank you so much. Maybe you can now stop sharing and we can, well, actually we have now, I think, 20 minutes for discussion, or even a little bit more, maybe. So let's start with that. And so, as you know, as per the protocols of the conference, you can just, paste on the chat your question. But as usual, there's people are a little bit shy, so I will start. And maybe I start with, also to keep it tidy and organized, I can start with Guilherme's presentation, but some of these can also, then come across in the other presentation. So any of the presenters, if you want to chip in some ideas, or you are more than welcome. So one of the things that was quite striking in Guilherme's presentation was this idea, of course, the duality of the public space, domesticized, and the domesticization of public life. But one of the things that for the Paulista School and for the cases that you presented, so this idea that making or a critique of the bourgeois domestic space or domestic practices entails that you expose the domestic to the public. But I wonder why. Even using the Marxist narratives and discourse. So why would you do that? What is the let's say the political support for that? Because to a certain extent, one could say that one of the key words for bourgeois domestic space is comfort. So why would you, let's say, not enable the working class or whoever let's say is the subject of this work to benefit from comfort? Don't you think that there's some sort of fetishization of this publicity in the domestic space rather than emancipating, let's say the working class or whatever? It's probably alienating them from their rights to comfort.
Okay, Nelson, thank you. Good question. In general, when I show this image and talk about this in classes for students, sometimes they think in the same way, but the first thing we have to think about, I think, is that specific moment of the history of Brazil. So the examples I chose to show here was built and inaugurated specifically around 68, 69, and 70. So exactly around the AI5, I5, the institutional act in the dictatorship that was the worst moment for repression, torture of this. And many of these architects and artists were being arrested or going to exile or to torture and all of this. So what I think is that in these cases, they were creating works of art. Let's call a house a work of art. So they were creating works of art like an aesthetic guerrilla. So if the life is violent, we will put the violence again in our works. So we will double the violence. So that's why maybe if we look at these examples with our eyes in our time, maybe we can think about this like a fetishization, as you said. But if you try to think about this in that moment, it's different. So as Artigas said to Elsa Bercó, who was a client in a house in the same period, Elsa Bercó is a professor of history or sociology, being part of the same Communist Party. So in 67, she asked him to design a house for her, and Artigas said, "You're crazy. I'm an almost arrested architect." So that's the point, I think. The same happened. I don't want to talk so much. The last thing. The same happened with the scenography of Lina Bobardi to Teatro Oficina in 69, in the jungle of the cities, the play by Brecht. She decided to build the scenography with the trash of the streets because it was being built, the Minhocão, the big viaduct cutting the city, the neighborhood, and demolishing many houses. So she used the trash of the houses demolished to build the scenography. So the decision is to put inside the theater the destruction of the city and destroying it again by the actors during the play. So my answer, it was a very specific moment of violence, and this is the case.
Thank you so much, Guilherme. And maybe I take that cue to move to Luana and to ask her about when you were identifying the continuities and discontinuities between Caraíba and Malagueira. Well, of course, I know Malagueira very well. It was one of my case studies for the PhD. And so one of the things that, of course, it's interesting in Malagueira, it's this, again, you have this courtyard house and then you have the street. But there seems to be a very, at first sight, a harsh transition between the realm of the private and the realm of the public, really sort of, missing some sort of what Aldo van Eyck would call thresholds, right? Or this kind of intermediate places. But there's also something else, which is this idea of community. So when you think of Malagueira, and then I want to ask you in relation to Caraíba, in Malagueira, I know that CISA groups, let's say, these houses in such a way that the clustering strategy sort of tries to emulate or replicate is, as you rightly said, is reading of vernacular social and special practices in a clandestino settlement nearby. So to a certain extent, is a reinterpretation of ordinary forms of community, so to speak, right? Or sorry, of this kind of vernacular tradition. How is it with Caraíba? So how is this a continuity or a discontinuity? So if you think about this notion of community, which is also highly contested, of course. How do you see these two cases, or the duality between these two cases?
Nice question, Nelson. In the case of the Caraíba, it's like it's most close to a company city. So Guedes tries to mix the population, the employees and the bosses of the company, the mining company, in the urban space. So this notion of community is complicated because we have a company, we have a working class and other persons in high status. So it's completely different. I think it's a contrast, a discontinuity because of the birth of the Caraíba linked to some kind of activity in company. So it's difficult to talk about a community in the period of foundation of the city. But today, I know in my research that the people who still live there have a very close affection with the city center, the pilotis, the gallery. They have a strong identity linked with the architecture of the Joaquim Guedes. So I think now maybe in a very different way of Malagueira, we have a new community very close to the urban draw of Joaquim Guedes.
Yeah, thank you so much. And maybe now moving to Daniela's presentation, also a beautiful presentation. And it was also struck me when you showed your drawing, which I find beautiful, next to the picture of that event at is it the City Hall or no? What, that building in the corner? I don't remember the name. Rua 15, I think.
Rua 15.
Rua
No,
15.
it's a historic building that nowadays it is a bank.
All right. Now, so I think that you put some, provocative proposition on the table, because in exploring this duality between dwelling and an image, or between experience and spectacle. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you put it like, I mean, your drawing, your beautiful drawing, let's say the way that you map that particular urban circumstance, you put it in the side of dwelling and experience, whereas the picture, you put it in the side of image or imagistic feature or spectacle. Now, what I want to ask you is, I mean, don't you think that, let's say, the fact that a picture or a photograph, let's say, can be more truthful and does not need so many devices or to interpret as a drawing that you, for instance, you produced. In that sense, even in terms of communication, don't you think that the drawing that you produce has many more layers or codes that actually cannot be decoded by most of the people? I mean, we do that sort of exercises with our students. So we have now an interest also with architectural ethnography, where we actually ask the students to map, experiences of everyday life and try to create a visual synthesis of that. But to a certain extent, we also have to admit that those are using codes typical of the architectural discipline. In that sense, don't you think that the image could be more, close to experience, and your drawing more a spectacle? Probably not, but in any way, I would like to hear from you.
I don't know if how much I am able to answer it in English, but let me try. I think that when I started, I was talking much about the simulacrum, and I was against the hypervisibility, and I was against this image broadcasted by the city, and it was in this work, it was actually a language of architecture. It was the intent, because I was trying to work with the graphic space, and I also think in my case, the image, when we talk about a city that is often too broadcast like Curitiba, actually gives an idea of a simulated city. The photograph in the context of Curitiba was much utilized to broadcast an image to the public. So I was trying to go against this. Against this image used for propaganda, or to simulate a model of urbanism, of a clean and a perfect city, and without conflicts. So it was my attempt to show these conflicts, not, and I know that it isn't language easy to reading, but I also think that I was trying to attempt a notation that could be manipulated. So because of that, I printed all my maps, and I have like 200 of maps that I actually I trying to recommend these maps, and it was a part of my process.
Right. Thank you so much. And
Okay.
we could keep on with the discussion, but I have now a question for Alice. So it's by Leandro. And Leandro asks that, some authors differentiate graffiti from picho, such as Teresa Caldeira, the Brazilian anthropologist, for example. So in this case, the graffiti would have an artistic or even beautification purpose. The picho, on the other hand, would be the opposite. It would be a demonstration of discontent among minorities or excluded people against an unjust and unequal society. So the question is, do you work with this differentiation or not?
Should I ask or I answer? Well, we are of course aware of this differentiation, especially in Portuguese and in Brazil. It is a very common differentiation also in common language, but we decided to specifically use picho to encompass all this phenomena, and not only demonstrating that, okay, they are also in a way meshed together enough, like let's say representations of a phenomena that works also together. And specifically we chose to use picho as the word we use throughout the article and also the presentation, because it is more focused on this spatialized, territorialized practice of reclaiming this territory, not necessarily only by an aesthetic way or in a very aesthetic way, but in its own also language and its very specific aesthetics that are proper to it. So in relation to the whole anthropological idea, we thought that it also it fit better to use the word of picho instead of just calling it graffiti, because also this distinction has also been used in itself to criminalize picho artists, to try to create this division and stabilize or like establish what is art or what is valuable as art in these urban expressions and what's not. And so this line of this division between picho and art and picho as vandalism and graffiti as a valid form of art is one that we don't want to reproduce here.
And maybe just to chip in maybe some other duality here, and I think maybe you could also elaborate a little bit on whether issues of authorship or anonymity are also at stake here, because of course now I know that many municipalities around the world, pay big money to hire graffiti artists, to beautify the cities, which is quite interesting to see under the perspective of this being a kind of an act of resistance. But on the other hand, I don't know, but some of these sort of tags of signatures also try to preserve a certain anonymity. So you actually don't know unless you are part or initiated in that group. So being anonymous is also a key feature for this practice of resistance. Is that correct, or?
Yes, I think that is correct, and but also even being anonymous in the use of tags, it involves also a form of authorship in between or like inside this community of Pichadoris that work together and recognize each other's tags and work within and use this recognition also to actually to establish these territorial claims and this territory and this there's a whole system of value inside that goes on inside these networks of like where do you put your tag and how does that bring you some sort of peer recognition inside this community. So the authorship is also there. Of course, there's this anonymity that is important because of course it's a illegal practice that is being criminalized over and over. So there is this in a way this you could inside our own analysis and perspective here, you could say that okay, having this anonymity is one way of having another body or having another subjectivity that then you can act but preserving your position, and which in a perspectivist position, perspectivist terms, means being a predatory position, and you want to keep on being that way. And of course, all these exchanges are so the actualization of the practice is where you can lose also these positions. So it's where the relationships become sort of dangerous, or in these encounters between the subjectivities. And so this anonymity is also a form perhaps of protecting yourself from that. Whereas in graffiti, in other phenomena, you could say there is a different strategy. It's a strategy of actually incorporating this authorship, this artistic authorship, to then empower your position and enter an art market and enter other spheres that will also guarantee this protagonism and this agency to remain doing what you're doing and not fall back to a position where you are prey to this socio-economic phenomena.
Thank you so much, Eric. Super interesting. And I'm seeing also a question by Marcus to Luana. So to pick up on some points that we have discussed before. And so Marcus asks, besides understanding the typology and design strategy, could you also develop on the human actions, uses, experience of the connection between public-private and how it takes place in the contemporary city? Can you derive on the relationship between built intentions and lived space with a focus on the latter? Did design intentions generate what was expected?
So, Marcus, it's a very good question. I think I did not make it a little bit more clear in my talk, but in Malagueira, a lot of people who live there try to differentiate the habitats with vegetation, making their own stairs, or planting big vegetations with fruits. It's very common, this kind of differentiation. And also in some periods of a lot of Malagueira was built in a lot of phases. And one of these phases, it was a debate about the wall, the height of the wall. And in Portuguese culture, it's very important, the privacy. So I think the wall was there being discussed in this matter of privacy. In Caraíba, the appropriations of the public-private transition was a little bit more harsh because of the need to parking spaces inside the residential lots. So with the introduction of the cars, the whole interfaces and the big sidewalks, everything we saw in that pictures was changed. So this was the big transformation in Caraíba relations, is like public and private. I'm talking about the residential lots and the public space of the street. So.
Thank you. And maybe we still have 2 minutes, so maybe I cannot resist, let's say, to try and make Guilherme talk a little bit with Alice and Eric in the sense of how do you see, so maybe Guilherme, but you can also respond to each other. How would you see that, well, Hélio Oiticica, let's say, would we be also, let's say, you know, a fan of the Picho or as a fantastic possibility for say domesticizing, you know, public space, or the other way around? I don't know. I just thought that it was interesting to get you two in some sort of conversation.
Yeah, nice to think about. So I think Hélio would love the Picho. Hélio died in the beginning of the 80s, so it was exactly the moment when the Picho was starting in our cities. So this is an expression coming from the periphery to the center. So I think in this way. Can I add one idea to your first question to end this conversation? Think about your first question of fetishization and the secrets and the comfort of the houses. One thing that is important to think about also is that these architects, Paulo Mendes da Rocha, for example, he studied architecture during the 50s. So it's a generation that was being prepared to build new cities in Brazil, like Brasilia, like many others, for power plants. And after the military coup, there were a huge break of perspective. So they were restricted to design houses. Suddenly, only houses for friends of the Communist Party.
Single family houses, you mean?
Exactly.
Not housing.
Single family houses, bourgeois houses, middle class houses. So that's what Sérgio Ferro, in a very hard critic he wrote about this generation. He said, suddenly this generation of architects, they realized that they only had single houses to build, and they were building houses with the mind of building cities. That's why they were torturing middle-class people and our own families.
That's a nice thought. All right, so.
If I may just...
Sure, Alice, go for it.
If I could take a guess, I would answer yes. I think Hélio Oiticica would be very enthusiastic about Picho, and I think we can actually see that aesthetics on his work. That famous flag, seja marginal, seja herói, it's pretty much that, right? In English, it would be marginal, be a hero. It's like a stencil with a writing underneath it, one of his most famous works. And it's actually interesting because he has very high technique paintings, but he also has that flag, which is one example that is very close to the street aesthetics, right? So, yeah.
All right, well, I think this is a good way of wrapping up this session. Well, I enjoyed it very much, every minute. Beautiful, we saw beautiful presentations with beautiful images and great great text supporting these presentations. So thank you, Guilherme, thank you, Luana, thank you, Daniela, thank you, Alice, thank you, Eric, and of course in the case of Luana, also Raquel and Ricardo should be acknowledged, of course. So thank you all in the audience for being there. And well, I wish you a great conference. So now you are off the hook, so you can relax, me as well. So I have my glass of wine next to me. I'm going to enjoy it during the break. Bye-bye.